Okay, let's see. Okay. Oh, we have a bunch of people coming in now.
Yay!
Yeah. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in a moment. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to arrive, and then we'll get going. Thank you for coming. Okay. Looks like the majority of people are, well, a good number of. Do you want to go ahead and shall I start, Virginia? Or do you want to wait a moment?
Otherwise, we'll end up going too long later
Yeah,
on.
let's start, and people
Yeah, I
will
think
will
so.
come in as they come in.
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jocelyn O'Zolins from the Shelter Island Public Library, and we're privileged today to have 5 distinguished poets reading. I just want to quickly thank Virginia Walker for curating this program, and of course, thank all the poets for reading and for discussing their work. And with that, I will turn you over to Virginia Walker, who will introduce the poets.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Welcome to the webinar, The Role of the Poet Today, sponsored by the Shelter Island Library. I have admired Jacob Bronowski, the scientist with a conscience, ever since I watched his program on the BBC, The Ascent of Man, which premiered in 1973. Recently, I purchased a biography of him by Timothy Sandifer. I read the book in stunned shock. Why did I not know this? Jacob Bronowski, the revered scientist, was also a poet. From his days at Cambridge University, where he started an avant-garde poetry magazine, and where he worked with Robert Graves and Laura Writing on many projects. How anybody could work with Laura Writing is beyond belief. And he then continued to promote rationality and compassion in the public sphere through his work with many institutes and other scientific institutions that employed him. And he continued to write poetry all his life. He wrote a book on William Blake, the poet, and he also wrote A Poet's Defense in the temper of Shelley. He believed poetry, it was very important. I have a quote here from him, from his poet, The Poet's Defense. The mind of man has a knowledge of truth beyond the near truths of science and society. I believe that poetry tells this truth, unquote. Well, wow. I should not have been surprised that Bronowski wrote poetry. Poets are amazing people. They reach out to others with a truth they have discovered in language, new, original, or their own. Whatever careers they have had, they are teachers of humanity. Today, you will meet 4 such people, all poets of merit and mentors to many. George Held hails from Sag Harbor in New York City. Gladys Henderson lives in Wisconsin. Robert Savino comes to us from West Islip. And Leela Zimbaren lives on Shelter Island and teaches at New York University. I will introduce each poet, and we will hear their poetry and their ideas on the role of the poet. They'll be in 2 sections. The first will run about 12 minutes. Then I'm going to sneak in a poem of my own, have to do that. And then we'll go back to the poets, but in reverse alphabetical order for about 3 more minutes from each poet on his own work or her work and what she thinks the role is. And then I hope I have time for 1 more poem and some rapid fire questions for our poets. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first poet in alphabetical order, and that is George Held. George Held is a great critic of society, believing that poetry must be political in the best tradition of Whitman. He's a retired professor of English. He last taught at Queens College, and he's the author of 3 full-length poetry books, Beyond Renewal, After Shakespeare, Selected Sonnets, Culling, New and Selected Nature Poems. He is a lover of nature and a master of poetic form. From sonnets to haiku, he writes with brilliant authority. He has 11 Pushcart Prize nominations, in addition to 13 chapbooks of poetry. By the way, I have only some of them here. They're marvelous books, all of them. I collect George Held. He also sends me his books. He's a doll. Anyway, he's also recently written 4 children's books. He has a collection of short stories forthcoming from Poets Wear Prada in 2022. He taught at Queens College and now retired. Recently, he has read his poetry on Zoom for the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association and PPA Palm Beach. George Held.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And just to show you that your very kind words have not entirely gone to my head, I recall that when I was a teacher at Queens College and I was teaching English majors, I would ask them early in the semester, maybe the first day, did you read a poem today or yesterday? Raise your hand. No hands went up. Well, did you read a poem last month? And no hands went up. And then I said, did you read a poem in the past year? And no hands went up. So I learned that the role of the poet to even my poetry majors in a first-rate college was not held in high regard. Nevertheless, Virginia's prompt had me think a lot about what my role as a poet might be. And I remembered reading W.H. Auden's poem of the late 30s, not sometime when I was in college, in the 50s, in memory of W.B. Yeats. And every literate person of my era remembers that in that poem, Auden writes, poetry makes nothing happen. I don't know if it means that it takes poetry to make nothing happen at all, or if it means poetry makes nothing happen, but it makes it do other things. I don't know. But in any case, he follows that pregnant line with the following: poetry that is, it survives, a way of happening, a mouth. That puts a very high responsibility on every poet to make sure his or her mouth is adequate to the task of making poems. And I believe since Auden wrote that, I know that it's well known that Auden recanted and said he was sorry he ever wrote that line. But all poets who are familiar with it, it seems to me, often write as if to make something happen. As if to make something happen. And even I once thought I could do that. I wrote in the preface in 2013, now 8 years ago, I hope that readers of these poems will act on a sense of our shared need to conserve what's left of the imperiled natural world. Now we know that there's an emergency regarding our natural world right now.
Right now.
And it appears that the natural world will succumb to a horrific rise in temperature by historical standards by the end of this century, if not by 2050. And yet, who is getting exercised about it? If I ask my students today,
Poets.
are you aware of the threat to our climate? Probably few would raise their hands. So here we are wondering, what can we as poets do if nothing seems to make a difference? Well, the poet, the painter, Judy Chicago, who is finally being recognized decades after she did her most original work, recently wrote for a retrospective of her art in Chicago, art matters only if it deals with issues that people care about in ways that they can understand. Well, if the audience doesn't care about climate change or poetry itself, what can we do to write in a way that will recruit them to the side of truth and all the wonderful things that Virginia said poetry and poets stand for? So, thinking of the role of the poet, I searched my poems for implications of what a poet's role might be. And one thing that I came up with was that the poet can be a recorder. Luckily, after 9/11, I wrote a poem that has continued to be read, as one of my former student poets wrote me recently. It's timeless. Well, yes, that's great, but will it make anything happen? Here's that poem on 9/11. It appeared in both the Queens College newsletter and the Radical magazine, first of the month. It's called That Tuesday Night. So I'm the recorder here. I remember that 9/11 was on a Tuesday. We just celebrated its 20th anniversary on a Saturday, last Saturday, 1 week ago today. That Tuesday night, after the towers burned and fell downtown, after watching them crumble, unlike the one Paul Newman saved in Towering Inferno, from the plaza in front of Rosenthal Library, that's at Queens College, after walking home from the subway in the yellow summer twilight, gagging on the acrid air and looking at the thick, sooty column rising downtown where the towers had loomed gargantuan on the skyline for over 3 decades. I went to wash my face as though cold water and soap would wake me from this dream of violence and violation. And I saw that man in the mirror, red-rimmed eyes, yes, but the same sagging, wrinkled skin, the same thinning, graying hair above the same lined forehead. And I knew that he was lucky to have lived to 65, too young for World War II and Korea, too old for Vietnam, lucky to have lived his soft American life without much fear from abroad, except spotting airplanes as a kid and catching a breath or two as JFK stood down the Russians in 62. And in the glare of the bathroom light, the sirens screaming just up the street at St. Vincent's, I knew nothing could ever make me feel safe again. And I still don't feel so safe. But I'm glad people still read this poem and feel that it has something, at least in the sense of recording the time I lived through. As we know, millions of Americans weren't even born in 2001 when the World Trade Towers were bombed and brought down. And another way that I think poets can be recorders is to address the very nature of being a poet, which is also to be a human being. This poem I'm going to read next, only 3 lines, was influenced by Stanley Kunitz, who used to be a remarkable gardener.
He was.
And I wrote this poem called Poets, which is in my collection, Culling, which Virginia already held up. These books are all available still. None of them has sold out. Poets are gardeners, planters, pruners, gleaners, till they are mulch. Poets are gardeners,
Yeah,
pruners, gleaners,
yes.
they are mulch. So again, another comment on our delusion of
Right.
what our role might be. And Virginia, I think my introductory time is up, and I'll turn it back to you. Virginia, you have to unmute.
Hold on.
Yay.
There we are. I'm sorry. I had to get myself unmuted. Thank you, George. I will come back to you later. I don't know if you used all your time, but we will come back to you later. I want to introduce our next speaker, and that's Gladys Henderson. And Gladys Henderson has promoted poetry on Long Island through many events and publications. She lives for these promotions of poetry and workshops with other poets, and poetry has been her mainstay through many adversities. She trained in art and psychology, was a teacher of art in private and public schools. She also worked as senior executive for Macy's department store. She created a workshop in poetry for the Robert Frost Foundation in Sugar Hill, Franconia, near Franconia, New Hampshire. I know that very well, that area, thereby raising money to support the foundation. She was Poet Laureate of Suffolk County from 2017 to 2019, and her poetry book, Eclipse of Heaven, has one of her paintings on the cover. And this poetry book is in the Richard Varney collection of the Shelter Island Library, because I brought in one of Gladys's poems from this book one time when we had a round table and Richard liked so much. And then after he died, when we set up the books for in memory of him, I made sure Gladys's poems were there. She has many awards for her poetry on Long Island, and she's a finalist in any national competitions. Gladys. Gladys, you're on.
Thank you, Virginia. Aman, can you hear, are we good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm going to put
Well,
myself.
if you can hear me, then other people can hear me. Thanks so much, Virginia. And I love the whole idea of the differences of this, because with George, it's as if George and I sort of said, how will we create an interesting a texture? And I'll begin with my thoughts. I've always believed that poetry is a healing art. And as a poet, readers of poetry understand that they are not alone in their suffering or in their pain or in their joy. I've always felt as if it was a healing art. Poetry creates empathy. Perhaps no other reason is more important to write poetry than it binds us together, that it makes us one family. As we experience the shrinking of our world through the advances of electronics, and believe me, this world of ours is shrinking every moment. I believe that the poet of today has an important opportunity and role in bridging the gaps of our differences. Poetry is a healing salve, even when its subjects are disturbing. Either astringent or healing balm, the truth is poetry dissolves what separates. Poetry dissolves what separates, allows the reader of a poem that resonates with them to understand their thoughts, perhaps for the first time in a way never understood before. A poem can literally alter the way a person sees their world. I'm sure there's been a moment when you've just turned around and said, oh my, Oh my. I believe one of the roles of the poet today is to carry on the tradition of opening the doors and avenues of our camaraderie, to remind us that we are not alone in our suffering, to be brave enough to give words to the forbidden. I think the poet of today is called to connect us as part of the larger human family. And now a few poems that I hope reflect that. Tabernacle. Snow brushes, golden oaks and maples, bright leaves still intact. A brief stillness. Air is prayer, crows sing the blessings of feeders filled with seed. And I stand at the window writing al fresco visions, place my soul on the line between two seasons. May this moment be forever and for you, stranger, for whom I am always longing. Today, nothing changes the arc of light. It moves as it must, falls behind us, used well or not. No time for the luxury of review. When the minute is finished, it cascades as ash, dissolves into the cosmic sea that accepts everything, for better or for worse. Memo to myself. Memo to myself. Oh, you who I have trusted all these years, far now, far away, snagged like a whale in trap ropes, tethered in dark fear. The phone call, the doctor's report, the wave of needles into thin blue veins, the searing word, oncologist. Where are you now, brave one? Have you ever had a night that just didn't end? Waiting out the night. From across the lake, a loon's mournful calls, one whose measures cuts into my futile sleep, a welcome guest this evening. As my lover soars away in deep slumber and I am left alone to face the midnight arcade, its bolt thrown open by searing pain, its transmuted outpouring swimming to the surface, waiting to be caught in the trap nets of my mind's theater. Its skillful web trolls deep into the stratum of my history, leaves nothing unearthed, haunting images tremor my body, sees all vestiges of peace. Whose faces are these that stare up at me in brutal contempt or surprise? The long line of those who wished more from me than they received. They swim with me across the ciborium of night. Their faces taunt me with their regrets. Perhaps another reincarnation will provide the landscape to repair my failures, erase the ghosts that walk with me now. No, there is no one to awaken this evening. No one wishes to see my wounded palms or broken body, or to hear me recite the names of those who excoriated my innocence, rented my hope of salvation to someone who didn't even want it to begin with. I wait for the pain to leave, for sleep to break the cycle. Again, the loon calls. His refrains mend my isolation. At last, I fall free, hold on to its wings, and rise with his songs into healing sleep. Thank you.
Beautiful. I noticed that we already heard from two poets, George, who talked about recording and talked about pitting himself against the world and what was happening. And then, and of course, and some of his little sardonic comments there at the end about mulch. But anyway, but you have done something here. I also think, and by the way, we got a little feedback and the sound. So when you're on the other, when you come back to us later, I think maybe you should speak more closely or something. I don't know. I just got a little grating sound in the background. I'm not sure that what that was. But I also loved how you saw it as a healing art, Gladys. So we've had a recording and now we have the healing art, and you gave us a beautiful example of that. And now we're going to go on to our third poet, and that is Robert Savino. Robert Savino, when he became the Suffolk County Poet Laureate in 2015, discovered this whole other part of himself because he began to mentor young writers from that role. And one of his students went on to win first place in 7 poetry events in 2 years. He discovered this totally new role that he had not expected for himself. He's a board member of the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association, and Robert Savino was the Suffolk County Poet Laureate from 2015 to 2017 and Bard's Laureate from 2019 to 2021. He won the Oberon Prize, that's a very good prize, in 2008. He was also the co-editor of a bilingual collection of poetry, No Distance Between Us, a collection of Long Island Italian American poets. He is the author of 2 poetry books I'll mention. The first title is Out of This World, Fireballs of an Illuminated Scarecrow. Okay, run that by you. And one I do have, Inside a Turtle Shell. I do have that book. And he lives with his wife and family in West Islip. Robert Savino.
Thank you, Virginia. And thank you, Jocelyn, for putting this together too. I'd like to start with an acronym that I use on how I perceive myself as a poet. And the acronym is PIT. PIT, like the stone of a fruit. PIT, like the center of development. P, to promote. I, to inspire. T, to teach. And as I go through this, I'm going to take you on the journey of how those fit in to my reign as a poet. It started for me in the 10th grade. I went to a professor of mine after reading Blake. I had an interest in Blake and went to a professor of mine. I said, I'm not the best student in the world, but I'm really enjoying this poetry. Can you help me out? What can I do? He said, son, read. Read, read, read was his message, something you'll never forget. And coincidentally, that follows one of the quotes by Blake, which is the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. So it was, that became my inspiration. A poem that I will read now is from my first inspiration, and it's called Mentor. Awakening at night to voices from the bookshelf, muffled in the stir of eager air. Pantomime poets perform in shimmering ribbons of light. Fingertips snap jaundiced pages, a labyrinth of words windswept. These are not drafts. I capture mysteries from sequences of stanzas like stealing the moment between darkness and dawn. None of these old poets know me, yet they encroach ethereal doors to hold vigils, awake immortal images, and ask for nothing. Someone is watching the house. Someone is watching over me. Someone I can't see in the dust on the bookshelf. That interest soon became a passion for me, and I became inspired by the teaching of mentors myself, some of which were well known to the East End: Dan Murray, Alan Plans, George Wallace, and Maxwell Weed. In fact, if it wasn't for Dan Murray, I would not be here today. Dan Murray was a teacher. He was my inspiration. And at times when I was on a downspin and didn't think my writing was good enough, he was unwilling, and I emphasize unwilling, to allow me to quit. So I owe being here to Dan Murray. Then in 2015, I became the poet laureate. I had the term of 2 years. And like Virginia mentioned, I took on a new role. You become the ambassador of your art. And again, I go back to that acronym of promote, inspire, and teach. I was inspired by Dante for quite a number of years. And the project that I did put together was a anthology of Italian American poets from Long Island. Why? To promote Italian heritage and courage and culture, to inspire Italian American poets, and to preserve the teaching of the Italian language in the schools. And that was the purpose, and that also goes back to that acronym. The second collection of New York State Italian American poets will be available in October, and a future anthology will be national and perhaps international Italian American poets. And what I'm left with, like Dante, is a trilogy. I'll read one of the poems that will be in the October version of New York State Italian American Poets. Not every schoolboy knows. When I was a young boy, I would hide under the bed and read the adventures of wee Winnie Winkle. The rhyming of words was music to my ears. Crossing bridges of time, I often set out to search for something uncommon, but magical to me. Each span a stepping stone to the temple of words. Notwithstanding the poetry masters, I became enchanted by the Italian triumvirate of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and studied between covers of the Divine Comedy. I journeyed 9 levels deep into the unknown terrain of imagination, often passing a vision of a young, sad-eyed, olive-skinned, unfamiliar girl. I awakened mornings at the hour of the wolf, to Beatrice, the eternal flame of the heart, guiding my quill through shadows of transformation. Dante, I am small amidst your trinity. If only I could have lived to be your apprentice, I would have opened doors of enlightenment to the conscious mind. Today, I open young minds to the cradle of your seeds, teach the secrets of good and evil's destination. I am old, though inside I boast the spirit of your voice. Then that led to a project by my friend Gladys, which was the mentor-mentee project. And she asked me, Robert, would you be interested in being a mentor? And at first I looked at my schedule and hesitated, but didn't hesitate for long. I was matched with a 13-year-old, wonderful student. He is now a freshman in high school. And as Virginia mentioned, he was a contest winner. One of the contests was the Grand Champion Award from the Walt Whitman birthplace. And as a poet, as a role of a poet, that made me proud to say I was his teacher. I was his teacher. We both had interest in sports. Before he came to our Saturday session, he was playing soccer all morning. I still play senior softball, my old age. I'm going to read the poem that is in that book that Gladys had published and that I wrote for Christian. It's titled Ballpoint and Goal Zones. From the kick tip of the toe to the ball point of the writing stick and tap tap of the alphabet keys, streams of thought began to flow, not only in the blue of seas or the black of storm clouds, but in all colors of imagination, along with the roar of thunder outside margins of fair play. Each line driven by strategy, eyes focused in execution on the empty-bellied target. But this story is not mine. I am a Saturday morning listener. Observe the gaze of intensity, the transition to a notebook, and listen to the words. The voice from a shadow between goalposts calculated seconds after the final whistle blows. The same voice that resounds amidst rows of reflective assembly. I know that voice. It's his. And for me, there's nothing more.
Oh, thank you, Robert. That was lovely. Did you finish? I wasn't sure. I was cutting you
I
off.
don't know if
there.
my time up. That's good.
No, I
could be
don't know.
finished.
If you had more to go ahead, I'm sorry.
But what I'd like to do, and although this poem was heard by many people who I know who are listening, I'm going to read this last poem, and it is the Oberon prize-winning poem.
I got to hear that.
This was written actually at 4 a.m. in the morning, sitting on the floor next to one of those night lights that you plug in, on the 4th birthday of my first granddaughter. And a word was never changed after it was written. Breakfast with Sophia. She wakes on a bed in the living room in the dark. She crawls to the foot and peeks over the edge to see if I've been to sleep at all. Then hinges into a series of karate moves and says, Grandpa, I'm going to beat you up. I engage for a short while, then quickly take to the breakfast table a clandestine coward. After one period of Fruit Loop table hockey, she eats. I tangle with nocturnal words aloud. She lifts a spoon, holding them like nunchucks, and says, Grandpa, you a knucklehead. Then follows me everywhere with her mother's eyes, a pastime of summer fun all over again. When she leaves, flowers in the garden droop. Crabgrass and dandelions peek out over the sod. I imagine her return as a teen or a young adult, reading this poem to me or saying, come on, Gramps, I can't dance to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You know, at 4 a.m., sometimes it's a very good time to write poetry, as long as you're not inebriated. But that can be very nice. We're going to go on to another poet now, and I'm going to, in a moment, turn off a fan, which I hope is not interfering anything with a background noise. I'm not sure. Leela Zimbaren has helped create a renaissance in Latin American writers writing in Spanish and having writing careers in America. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Argentinian born, but living in New York since 1985, Leela Zimbaren is the author of numerous poetry collections in both Spanish and English. Two of those titles in English are Guardians of the Secret and Mauve Sea Orchids. She has collaborated with other poets and artists, including poet Joe Navarro and artist Per Salinas. She is the creative editor of Zul Solar, Jorge Luis Borges, The Art of Friendship, published in 2012. Her poetry is in many anthologies, including The Body and Language and Herbe sobre el Mundo Castigado. A chapbook about her work with Latin American poetry in America was published in 2016. She authored a book on Gabriela Mistral, the Chilean Nobel Prize-winning poet, and was director and editor of the Rebel Road series of poetry publications. And this is one of those publications she produced, the Rebel Road. And she used to have a lot of poets come here to Shelter Island to read. Since 2004, she curates the KJCC poetry series at New York University, where she also co-founded in 2007 the NYU MFA Creative Writing in Spanish, where she also teaches at NYU. So I think that's an amazing thing that she did there. She won a Guggenheim Fellowship for Poetry, and she was a finalist for the Lira Award from Ecuador with her poetry collection, Materia Blanda. Leela Zimbaren.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for including me in this group that I see that all of you are really connected, and you are doing an amazing job in Long Island and whatever, expanding poetry. And I'm trying to do the same thing, but in Spanish, because I write in Spanish, and many writers and poets here write in Spanish in the United States. And that's one of the reasons that we created the MFA at NYU, the MFA in Creative Writing in Spanish. It's very difficult for me to say what is the role of the poets. I think I agree with everything that had been said here. So I decided more to go directly to some of my poems and see how everything evolved, and in my poetics, because my poetics, of course, it's going to say what is the role of the poet. So I think it's easier for me to do it that way. My idea of poetry in general is, and what I teach too, is like each one should enter into its own obsessions and compulsions and try to say it and to transcribe that into words in the most effective way. And if one is synchronized with these compulsions and do it in the right way, let's say, I don't know what is right anyway, the reader will also connect and get into that experience, as Gladys said, of healing in a way, because I also feel like poetry, to heal a compulsion, let's say, we have a compulsion, and that is something that is troubling us a little bit. So my first poem published in my first book in 1993, I want to say something else. All these poems have been translated by different translators. So I don't know, these translators are Lorenzo Bueno, my son, who translates my work, Rosa Alcalá, and Mónica de la Torre, Daniel Feeman, and Christopher Wings. I just mention all of them together because it's easier now. The role of the translator is really important because it has to get in tune also with your work, with your rhythms and with your sounds in another language and put it into the next language. So my first poem published, I will read it in Spanish and then in English. It's very short. And it says, se abre la herida y es una boca que quiere hablar. The wound opens and it's a mouth that wants to speak. That was almost one of its, and this opens up a whole book about the relationship with the body, the wound and the body. And it had to do with pregnancy in that moment, but I think that wound opened and it developed many other books. So from my second book, I want to mention this one, in what way we are synchronized with our own writing. And I wrote, this is the last poem of my second book. It is night and the disquieting voice of the written word slips through your body. Graphics are seen as insane forms of aesthetic material. Inertia of the insatiable that submits to words' voracity, until night's depth has the clarity of a dream to be forgotten. My poetry goes very deep inside, I think. I don't know if deep, goes inside. And I think that this led me the interest in dreams and visions and going into the body, led me to a book that was translated into English. It's called Mopsy Orchids. And it led me to think about the body in the microscopic way, like going into the body, into the cells, which is something that everybody shares. There's no difference there. Everybody shares. And I wrote many poems trying to get into a rhythm of a cellular language. So this is one of those poems. When the flower opens its thoughts to the restlessness of things, a cellular language bursts from the most distant portions of a chain of sounds, materialized in chemical processes that in essence do not involve the brain, but the connections between the ends and the tissues. Emotion, like a cable charge in an evening storm, emits dangerous sparks as inanimate suddenly becomes electric eel, phosphorescent dragon in the blue night, whip of light. In that synaptic process in which the spark renovates the signals, the sounds of the inorganic fulfill their reinvigorating function. Honeysuckle, water diviner, planetary, molecular, entwined, cavernous, chains of sound imprinting the miracle of the conversion of one substance into another. In this mood that I was when I was writing this poem, this type of poem, which was in Shelter Island in the summer of 2001, I wrote this kind of epiphanic book. And then, as George mentioned, 9/11 came. So with this same language or the same shape that I was writing, I had to talk about or the feeling of violence. So this is another book called Torn, which my son has translated recently. It's a poetic diary from 9/11, 2001 to 9/11, 2002. And this is March 11, 2002 at night. Two towers of light are ignited in the empty space, poltergeist sprouting from the earth towards the dark, a road, an exit door. Should this be their trajectory? Will the substance of so many suspended bodies depart from this illuminated hole? The body destroyed, is that substance also destroyed? Or will shreds remain there, circling around like lovers looking for each other after a catastrophe? Can I imagine something less limited? The shine flogs my throat. The grit of all this vital matter wanders in awe through these streets that are thus ghostly. What about everything left floating? Is there a symmetry that can contain so much waste, that can channel so much stupor, so much crossed fate? The vibrations of death are close. There is so much luck that is unresolved. 9 men convinced that paradise resounds before their eyes wander with others in a confusion that has yet to disentangle, a substance stuck to another, all of it a ligament. Matter is no longer what hurts. It is this mess of energy that doesn't know up from down, where it's going or towards what. God willing, we say, ojalá, with unknowable levels of sadness for lives we never celebrated. And the last one is also about the same book, April 2002. To decipher the hieroglyphic of that book within me, as Proust said, is perhaps to understand the dimension at which a superior mind can arrive at in order to plan dismemberment, the disjunction in a phenomenon of thrust and force that pulls the bones out of its joint. Like when we pull at a chicken leg to remove it from its thigh. It is a task of tearing away the most delicate tissues and separating what was once part of a whole. So I think I will finish there.
Thank you, Leela. I found those poems on 9/11 in retrospective so arresting. Oh my goodness, some of your imagery. And Robert, thank you for talking about that, an acronym, which I think is so possible for all the poets here I love that. Promote, inspire, teach. I think all the poets here are doing that. I'm going to interrupt the flow of things for a minute. A friend of mine had said that he doesn't like to write poems that can become dated. So he never writes about something that's actually going on right then. I thought, what? Because I sometimes think you have to write in a white heat, the 4 a.m., things like that.
Yeah,
And otherwise you don't write at
Yeah.
all. And tranquility, well, that might be for daffodil,
correct.
but not for all. So this is, I'm going to try to read this fairly quickly. It's a long poem, but it speaks to things going on right now. It's called Now Playing, Hallucination Without Theme Music in 4 parts. 1, Night Track. Never seduced by marks. I sleep with night terrors. Kant sitting astride the horse of duty. Hegel following in a cart, holding a grand plan for all time, for all, every hour. Marcuse gallops on an ass, proclaiming justice lets murderers run free. And last, lying atop a Komodo dragon is Derrida, brandishing an eraser to critique and cleanse all literature. The medieval has returned without a church, just the doctrines as virulent as any promulgated by Pope or Savonarola or Thomas More. The woke zombies circle the arena, don black vests, and shoot all the non-believers, dictate what to say, where to live, when to travel, what to read, who can write, who can live. What damage ideas can do to all of us, what destruction a few professors have wrought, and still others follow. A world of pure forms ends in piles of bodies rotting in the sun. A world of pure reason ends in worship of savage instinct. What is the thinking being to do? Is there no exit from this track? 2, interlude for Danish Siddiqui, photojournalist. A truth seeker embedded with Afghans was abandoned after injury in a battle, and the Taliban found him, an isolated man. His mutilated body, shot, driven over, cannot record anymore. But his Reuters colleagues have listened and carry on. Truth seekers do not rest, continue to do honor to Danish and prevent the first casualty from prevailing. For the Taliban, the journalist is the first to be killed. No free thought is permitted. Musicians are next. No joys are permitted in hell. 3, coda. Women of Afghanistan, children about to be trained to die. What can I tell you? You do not sense. You are forgotten by those who have conned their way to wealth and fame. I wish I could shield you from what is to come, but I cannot. 4, finale. I hear the anguished cries of the mothers and fathers of 13 young Americans blasted into blood, betrayed by feckless bureaucrats who equate our young warriors with intolerant fanatics and cast our own people onto the board of an old game. Now, in that book that Bronowski wrote on William Blake, he said the following: the poet must be seen as a whole, and what is read of him should be a whole. Well, we want to get more from our poets here so we understand them as a whole. And I'm going to go backwards through the alphabet. So Leela, that means you're up first. What do you want to add to this discussion or more poems?
Oh,
You have 3 minutes. You have 3 solid minutes to do whatever you want.
I will read. I was
We'd love to hear another poem. I know we
planning
would.
to read more, but I don't know what to say. Should I say it? Okay.
You can do whatever you
This is
want. You
from
have
my-
3 minutes.
Yeah. Yes, I
About-
rather do it because it's like it shows how the poetry is working and what is it doing.
Yes, that's what I'd like to hear. Yes.
Yeah. So this is a book called, the last book that I published is called Matrix Lux. It's a book about illness, and I think I share with Gladys that I went through cancer too, like 5 years ago. And since my poetry is very meditative, I started meditating when I was sick, and thankfully I'm good. And I was singing like a chant that is called Ramadasa Sase Sohang, which is Ramadasa Sase Sohang. I repeated that a lot It's like a healing mantra. So I wrote many poems with that Ramadasa on the top. So this is the first one. To bend before an intelligence which manifests itself as white light. It covers and contains and overflows us all. To bend before the tender resonance of molecules and the energy that goes beyond touch. To bend before sanity, sanctity that regenerates itself in the emphatic modulation of light. To fill the womb with light is the maxim. To open touch to that light, white light, golden white. As a splayed lamp, wide open, the body wishes to touch life. What was it if not an alteration that was now extracted? Brutal procedure, just like a chemistry that is internalized to eliminate what may have been left beyond uncertainty in a domain that is red in the blood. I tell myself it's almost over for these patients to be no more than a memory. Then what? Contact that heals and the drug that complies and marks what in the body has been undone without the will specifying this or that. These are abstract, but also concrete states. Everything in place, the place of white fingers.
Thank you, Leela. Your imagery always draws me in, and I want to know more about it. Very, very good. Beautiful.
Thank you.
And now we're going back to Robert. Robert may want to add to this discussion that we're having about the role of the poet and his own poetry. Robert.
Yes, I mean, I stand since 2015, I stand on that mantra. I mean, I believe it brings me along this road as a poet. I also believe the fresh language of poetry illustrates inspiration and how things can become not as ordinary as they seem. And as a poet, it's our job to make that happen, to pass that along. I also believe that as a poet, you're a word man, and the mission is to captivate and motivate the multitudes that have an appetite for poetry. And in the spirit of Walt Whitman, I hope to encourage generations to come. And I will close with one poem. And I've often been told that everything I write is too serious. So I'd like to break away from that with this poem. It's a poem about forgiveness. Make no revision. Once a year, it's a requirement of Catholicism to confess sins. But I didn't know priests can see you now as clear as if it were the meat aisle in Pathmark on Friday. He never asked how long it's been. It was written across my face. But he asked how I've sinned. Father, I disobeyed spell check twice a day, dangled participles regularly, coveted O'Hara's lines twice, pirated Pound's words 4 times, and stole the only copy of On the Road from the local library in my junior year. I'm envious of Rexroth and Rimbaud, and lust for the lines that intoxicate the atmosphere in the White Horse Tavern. As an act of forgiveness, my son, gather your thoughts. Write 1 villanelle, 3 haiku, and 1 sestina. You will not erase or strike out, risk losing the moment of creation like this moment of confession.
Robert, thank you. And reminding me of confession. I would like to forget all that. Yeah. Thank you so much. What I also think is you were so hopeful. You talked about the multitudes interested in poetry. We're going to try to find those people, multitudes. I'm hoping, I mentioned to the local paper, the Reporter, that in this country of Colombia, they have an annual poetry festival and 5,000 people show up to hear the poetry.
Even more than that.
Yeah, even
Sometimes
more
it's
than that.
30,000
But here in
people.
America, we're hoping to get 10 to come into the bookstore. But anyway, be that as may, we're going to go to Gladys because she is going to add to our discussion. Gladys, you're on again.
We are. Thank you so much. We live in, let me just go forward and say we live in dangerous, unsettled times. And in my opinion, we've always been living in dangerous and unsettled times because I grew up remembering, pulling down black shades during World War II, the Korean War, which my brother served in, the Vietnam War, and the Iraqi wars, and any wars that I might not have forgotten. And human rights are being violated every day here and around the world. And I turn on the news and still another incident of racism. Crimes against women, other minorities are at the forefront of our news. And I believe more than ever, the poet of today must be brave enough to create poetry about social injustices, wars they don't perhaps support or understand, racism, crimes against women, gays, those moments that degrade the sanctity of another's life. We need to write them even if we're fearful. Naomi Shihab Nye said to me once when I told her that I was frightened, she said, write the poems even if you're frightened to show them. They will call you when it's time for them to be seen and will help you with the fear. I don't know. There's some poems that I've never published. But anyway, the world is so interconnected now. The poet of today must be the voice for those unable to speak, be the witness, the brave one who puts words to the suffering. And if I might, I have 3 poems that I'd like to read. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. They're not all
Okay.
10 minutes long, right?
Okay, I'm getting the count right. No, they're very short. Getting the count right. Inventory them. Take their belongings, comb, tissue, lifesaver, letter from home. Line them in rows. Call them by their hometowns, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Oklahoma City. Load them into the bellies of planes, a flag tucked around each one for the flight home to the waiting. Scrape the soil from your boots, begin again. Count them in Baghdad, count them in Nisariya. Take their belongings. The unidentified body. Someone waits for you, table set, dinner on the stove, and that childhood scar on your left wrist, small cruel butterfly of a rip. Your father will recognize it. He carried you home that day. The birthmark below your left knee, one earlobe smaller than the other. Your wife will know. Surely the clergy will remember you, how attentively you sat, hands at your side, the taste of consecration on your tongue, responses to their prayers, all properly done. Your children wait in their pajamas. A girl in a torn robe plays with a comb. The 8-year-old repairs tires on his bike. You have not come through the door, nor have they run to your side. You are late this evening. In a room filled with the smell of death, families weep. The appointed lift sheets stare at what remains, giving them names. One last body on the steel table waits to be identified. Outside, ambulances howl, race the panic streets. It was unlike you to be late, not to come home. Photograph of collateral damage. His head is covered with a prayer cap. An open shirt shows a throat moist from desert heat. In his arms, he holds a boy, body swathed in blood. His eyes look up like a supplicant in an El Greco painting. Abraham offering his son Isaac, the crucified cross, calling out, "Why have you forsaken me?" You touch the faces in the photograph with your fingertips, turn the pages looking for anything that will reassure you the boy survived. Advertisement with slick 2-page formats about new cars, nutrients to keep lawns growing, and pest-free articles of harvesting the wind classified for teaching in Brazil and Ecuador. Nothing about the boy. Calling me to comfort you. will serve no purpose. No one knows what happened to the boy. I suggest you make up a lie you could live with, a near truth, one that will keep you up at night, one that will not keep you up at night or interrupt your day. You've given up the search, made up your fairy tales with its happy endings. The boy's dark eyes are filled with anger. If he survives, perhaps he will learn how to build bombs. You have looked at the photograph so many times, the magazine falls open to the page.
Wow. Oh my goodness, Gladys. That last one, well, all of them have an incredible impact. And I didn't expect three such serious poems about the violence that we see every day. And in fact, you brought out something very important. How we look at something like that in a magazine, we have all these little other things in between, the advertisements, all these other things that are distracting us from naming what it is. So I really appreciate that poem. Beautiful. By the way, we're still getting a little feedback on you. I don't know why we're getting some feedback, but I heard, I think, every word. I hope everybody did. I don't know. It might be the phone you're using or something. I'm not sure. I hope everybody heard every word.
I'm
because
on
Gladys
my
is such a
iPad.
powerful poet. And now we return to George Held. George, we're back to you with your final thoughts and poems on anything you want to say on the role of the poet.
Well, what I wanted to say was to thank you for doing such a good job of finding four such disparate poets. It seems to me that as I was listening to them, Gladys and Robert would fall on the more optimistic line of the center, although Gladys she hadn't read these last poems when I made that formulation. And it turns out that Robert and Gladys have actually worked together.
They have.
And I feel a great connection to Senora Zimbaren because
You can call me Leela, actually.
Leela. Okay, Leela. Leela, I feel a great connection with your view of the world. It's dark, as mine has often been accused of being, and it is also European or Euro, as I think of it. And I have lived in Europe for 3 years. I've traveled all over Europe. And I've been I've not been in South America, but in Mexico.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, it was great to have this challenge to my own, I think of as rather narrow view of the poet and the world of poetry. And when Robert, for example, said that he had found a motto in the word pit, the first thing that came to my mind was the pit of hell, which is the center of one of my poems called Unfit to Morph, in which I fall into a deep black pit. I'm unable to extricate myself, and I have a vision of my soon to occur death as the only way I can morph from being in the bottom of this pit. But it just goes to show you how different we are as people and poets, no doubt about it. And I'd just like to quote briefly from two of my poems. So Virginia, you will finish ahead of time or on time.
Oh, I haven't asked you any questions yet.
Yes, that's true. I think my best collection of poems is this one, which you probably can't see the title of because it's this shiny part. It's called Bleak Splendor.
Oh, yeah, I
And
have.
that's the way I see the world. I don't see any splendor without its bleak counterpart moderating it or modifying.
Not that one.
Yeah, there you go. That's beautiful. That shows the cover. And in that, I have a very long poem, which I'm not reading. And I'm just quoting the last sentence. This is a poem on my father's death called In Time and Out. My father, who was educated in French and German in Switzerland and instilled in me a love of foreign languages and Europe. And by the way, I'm also a translator
Oh,
from French, Hungarian, and Latin.
wow.
And I know that you and Robert are also bilingual at least and translate frequently between your European and American English. I'm writing you now that you're dead, Dad. I conclude this poem. He shot himself, unfortunately, because I want to leave this record behind, the way you left your bloody corpse for your son to find. So there I go back to the idea of writing as a kind of leaving record of where I've been, what I've experienced and what I thought about it. And I also thought of the poet as a potential weatherman, thinking of Bob Dylan, and you don't know,
Yeah.
you don't know which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah, yeah.
And in my poem, Weather Alert, also in bleak splendor, I write, all the while, blue earth, you rumble and roar with thunder and lightning, torrential rains, hail as big as golf balls, and floods that would merrily float Noah's boat away, Gladys. Yet the drought grows ever more perilous in California and the old Dust Bowl states where there's no water for irrigation. 10 years ago, I was saying stuff like this. It's on the front pages now, finally. Where there's no water for irrigation, crops fail, food prices rise, and the quest for oil and gas intensifies like that televised tornado bearing down on your lonesome house. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, George. I do want to ask people some questions. We do have
Sure.
time for that. But I just wanted to mention something here. And that is that Gladys especially mentioned it, how you're trying to hold on. I think you used the minutes that are cascading into ash. Gladys, you had something like that
Yes.
in one of your poems. And it's
Yep.
about the ephemeral. We're trying to capture the ephemeral. The ballerina, I don't know if some remember her, Susanna Farrell, who was a Balanchine protege. She had a wonderful autobiography called Holding On to the Air. And I think a lot of times we poets, it's not just recording, but it's trying to hold on to all the sensations of life as they happen. And I think Gladys, you got
Yep.
into that a little bit, and certainly Leela, you did. So here's my final poem, then I'll go to your questions. And the sprites that I mention in this poem are not little creatures. They are lightning strikes high in the stratosphere, miles above us.
Okay.
And this poem, if I can turn it the right way around, is called In Early Summer Key. The leaves do not obscure all the sky. They offer transparencies close and high. Through the pale and deeper greens I see layers of experience in early summer key. Birds fly between the layers calling mates, while I, hypnotized by the opening of gates, understand how still is happiness in the shifting breath of light, shadow, phantomless. The air is electric with lightning. Sprites abound at the edge of space and set a frequency profound, agitating the globe's frail envelope. And yet I am not sundered from hope. Within my heart and mind, other storms ignite and pulse me in tune with an electrified kite riding thermals to investigate the known heaven, all we need who lean on trees in this realm of men. To love this earth, this glowing pearl above the leaves, is to know the veins of green pulsed beats of the eaves are shared by the creatures breathing below. In my arteries, my valves, all the flow forward of daily joy. The inner archer adverts as the arrow flies, that the Arctic snows, the deserts hold other creatures also tuned to the earth electric, and the oceans bring forth majesties poetic. Deeper go, and the heart, the molten heart is revealed, twisting the poles from miles within is the annealed minor sun, steadying the green crackle, the seas, the deep loams as they climb up the gravities, descend the declines of our dark, through the declines of our ride through the dark on an outward coil of stars. I, within, look up and mark an eternal moment in the light striking my eyes, mind excited as the sprites miles in the fiery skies. And I'm going to ask some questions here of my poets. And the first question I'm going to ask of George is, when, George, are you going to do those wonderful haiku workshops again at the South Fork Natural
Yes.
History Museum? We love them.
Yes,
When are you going to do them again, George?
Well,
Yes.
right now,
I know
I'm-
the COVID, yeah.
I'm speaking to you from New York,
Okay,
and I'm not even close to the east end of Long Island.
right now.
I'd be glad to do it, but I'm not even on the board of that nature museum anymore.
Yeah, you were so wonderful. We loved going there and learning
I
haiku was
still-
just something new for me.
I have a lot of haiku. I keep writing them.
Yeah.
All five I submitted recently will be out soon, and I'll send you a copy.
All right.
All right.
And you talked to me before all this about sometimes the trouble in finding an audience. I think we have to make our own audiences, don't we, George? We have to go out of our way to connect and make our audiences. These multitudes supposedly that are out there, I don't know. I think
Well,
Robert's very hopeful about that.
One of the reasons I'm grateful to you is that you bring an audience to these readings, but where would I go to do that?
Well, I asked the same question myself. And how has your being an author of children's books changed anything in your poetry?
Now, it's two different voices and two different imaginations
Okay, all
that
right.
work.
I was just wondering if it had any influence.
I just wrote a new children's book the other day,
Oh, good.
and my publisher, also my wife,
Yeah, he's got a deal here. He married a publisher. I mean, forget it.
said that it's my best one so far. So,
Okay, she would, wouldn't she? No,
Yeah,
I'm sure it's great. I'm sure it's great, George.
he has two now unpublished.
Well, she's lovely. Cheryl's lovely. Gladys, I'm going to jump onto you. I want to know how being a visual artist has influenced your poetry. Do you think it has an influence on what you write?
oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. For me, I have always looked at a scene, any picture, even a small square on the earth below me of gravel and a twig, and I'm looking at it and I'm speaking with it, I'm dialoguing it, I'm saying, what do I see? What does it remind me of? What's a metaphor? What's a simile? What does it have to do with my life? How does it reflect with me? And if anything, I can say to you that when I moved out of a figurative painting a little bit towards abstraction and even expressionist painting, but so I say that I have not yet done that quite with my poetry, but the work of observation and the need for authenticity of what I'm seeing it's beyond just the normal dimensions. We're talking about a whole nother dimension, because I have to understand it. If I can't understand it, I somehow would not be able to draw it. So all of that's happening when I'm looking at anything that's happening. In fact, I have a person who I went to for years as a psychotherapist who said to me, "You overthink things. You mean just keep it simple, would you? Just what are you
No,
doing?
Gladys,
Overthinking all the
don't
time.
change, Gladys, don't change. Forget that. We like the depth of your poetry. I'm going to have to go on to Robert quickly. And Robert, I was wondering, you give so many workshops and things. Where would you be giving workshops that people could attend?
I actually haven't given workshops in quite a while,
Oh, okay.
since I've been working on the mentor program.
Mhm.
I have 3 other people that I'm working with, the youngest being the student who is now a high school freshman,
Yes.
the oldest being a 94-year-old young lady. And
I love that story. I'm sure some people in the Art Rich Poetry Roundtable would like hearing that, because sometimes people only turn to poetry later on in life. And you have that new book is coming out when? Your new book, the anthology?
Should be the first week in October.
October, thank you. And Leela, I noticed that I was in the bank and my teller was wearing a Hispanic Heritage Month t-shirt. And then I got something from Barnes and Noble saying it's Hispanic Heritage Month. And I thought how often we only think of food and music and dance with Hispanic heritage, and we don't think of the great literature.
Yeah,
So I'm so
absolutely.
glad that you're doing so much with literature, Gabriel Mistral and Borges and all these
Oh,
wonderful
yeah.
writers you have worked with.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the American writers.
Yes, no, it's amazing also because there is such a huge quantity of writers writing in Spanish in this moment in the United States, not only poets, but, you know, fiction writers,
Yes.
chronicles, non-fiction, whatever. And it's going on, and it's like somebody called it like New York is the Paris of, because Latin American writers,
Yes,
a lot of
that's right,
went to France. But now New York is a place that it has such a movement. I can mention so many names that it's impossible to mention in
Okay,
this
but
moment.
it's a wonderful renaissance, and it's Spanish, you know, as English is spoken almost worldwide. So of course you can see how it has influence.
Well,
in so
52
many
million
countries.
people speak Spanish in this
Yeah.
country, no? But unfortunately, those are not the readers, maybe, of poetry.
No, that's true. That is true, but I'm so glad. And if somebody wanted to go to NYU and they wanted to get a master's in fine arts or whatever that is, you did the
Creative writing in Spanish. Yeah.
creative writing in Spanish. What school is that under?
It's under the Spanish and Portuguese department at
Spanish and
NYU.
Portuguese
Yeah,
department.
exactly.
All right,
yes.
well, thank you very much. I want to end, before I do my thank yous and everything else I have to do and get out of here, I want to end with a quote again from Jacob Bronowski. He gave a talk on knowledge of self for the American Museum of Natural History, and it was in 1965, I think. Quote, "A profound poem is not an exercise in resolution and does not teach us how to opt for one kind of action rather than another. The knowledge that we get from it does not tell us how to act, but how to be." Isn't that a great quote? And agrees with what George was saying earlier. I
Yeah,
think.
that's a great quote.
Yeah, and what many of you have been saying, and I so appreciate it. You were all wonderful, and all your poetry is so interesting, dynamic, and intricate, and the metaphors. And I mean, I'm just carried away. I get very high, I get very giddy, I get drunk on language when I'm a group of poets. I've always been that way. It's a little weird, but I get very drunk. Now, I want to thank Terry Lucas, the head librarian at Shelter Island Library, for arranging this webinar. I want to thank Jocelyn Oslin and all the little gremlins who are behind the scene who are keeping us in the ether and have done such a good job of presenting this. And I want to thank the Art Rich Poetry Roundtable for being in attendance, and all the friends and lovers of poetry from as far away as Scotland and California, New Hampshire. I'm just remembering all the states that are here, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania. A lot of people are watching this. And, you know, sometimes that's 3 in a household. So I'm very happy. And this is recorded and will be on YouTube. And Jocelyn will give us all the link, and then you'll be able to give it to your friends. And so there we will be for posterity. Okay?
Virginia, I want to add something that I'm so happy that I'm reading finally in Shelter Island.
Yes,
In
Leela,
the
it's
Shelter
about
Island Public
time, Leela.
Library, because I come here since 1986.
Yes,
So
it's about
I'm so
time,
happy
Leela,
to
and
be
you have
sharing-
had readings, but haven't read. Yes.
Well, maybe I read a couple of times, but no, I'm very happy. Like now, a different community is going to get my job and the job maybe of other poets that write in Spanish too in the future.
Yes, and Leela, we look forward to the new book, Torn. Is that the title, Torn?
Well, I hopefully it's going to be published. My son has almost finished translating it, and he did a very good job. So we are seeing where we can publish.
I
it.
told Leela that I never forgot the poem, The Mother's Cry, after 9/11, when she didn't know where her son was, and they lived in downtown New York at that time. And
Yeah.
that Mother's Cry, I never forgot that poem.
Mm.
And then now she has her son, who's now, I said he must be around 30, and he is.
He's
Now-
30 and
Yes,
he
and he's
hates
helping
me
you
because I
translate.
repeat his name like I don't know how many times in the poem, Lorenzo,
Yes,
Lorenzo,
it's
Lorenzo. And
a
I'm the
poem of a
character of
mother.
that
A mother
poem.
would
What am I going
understand
to
that
do
poem.
with that? It's crazy.
Yes. Well, thank you all. You were all wonderful, brilliant, and I'm sure people will be looking for your books and wanting to know more about you. And I thank the library again. And I think this is about time where Jocelyn has us all disappear. Is just about
You
time.
are our ideal reader.
Yes, you're great.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jocelyn.
Jocelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Hasta la vista.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you so much,
Jocelyn.
Virginia.